Hello, my name is Mary Wingo, and I am broadcasting from beautiful Cuenca, Ecuador. And of course, I love it. It's incredible. Anybody have a chance to come to Ecuador, please visit at least once. Okay, so what will we talk about today? Last week, we talked a little bit about sort of the deeper aspects of trauma, and we just barely scratched the surface. Guys, this is an incredibly important topic. I mean, I can't begin to tell you how deep this runs in our culture. And let me see, where do I start? Well, in the last video, where we basically scratched the surface about what trauma is. Trauma is a form of adaptation. Stress is adaptation, okay? It is the mechanisms of adaptation. So we need the stress response, okay? The problem is that we have usually too much of it in our society. Okay, so these are adaptive mechanisms, okay? And when I mean adaptive, I mean like Darwin, like Charles Darwin, like what Darwin was talking about. Okay, now what trauma is, and this includes post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, and other disorders of extreme stress that are not otherwise specified. Okay, let's see. How do I start out? Trauma, just to recap, is when our demands from our environment exceed how we can adapt to meet those demands. Okay, so what do we have? You've heard of the fight response, right? Where we fight whatever's going on. Okay, then you heard of the flight response, where we flee. Okay, we see a lot of animals, a lot of prey, like deer and rabbits, guinea pigs. My guinea pigs always ran. We'll do this. Then we have fight, flight. Then we have what's called fight, flight, flee. No, fight, flight, fawn. Okay, well, this is a term that is recently come in use, is fawn, which is a type of freeze. We'll talk about freeze first. Sorry about that. We'll talk about freeze. Freeze is when you and we know this. We've experienced this before. When we hit a stressor and we just freeze up. We can't fight. We can't fly. We cannot really respond. We just basically freeze up. Like, again, we go to a deer and say, like, the deer with the headlights looks in his eyes, where he's just frozen, can't do anything. Well, again, this is another type of way that we respond to stress. And then the fawn, which is kind of a new concept, but that is it's sort of like flee, but it's submission. It's just you submit. Okay, whatever you want. White flag, I submit. Okay. And these are psychological, but these are also biological responses. Okay. This is very, very interesting. So, as we talked about before, a lot of times trauma is not a one-off thing. It's a repetitive thing, because a lot of times it starts in childhood. A lot of times it starts from a dysfunctional family. And I know probably if you're traumatized, I'm sure your parents didn't mean to cause the harm. They did, or your family. I'm sure they didn't mean to. I'm sure nobody really, truly wants to cause lifelong damage by traumatizing a child, because that's what it is. Now, let me explain a little further. Okay, we talked about adverse childhood experiences, traumatic experiences as a child, like, say, parental divorce, addiction, mental illness, that kind of thing, abuse of various types, and how this this has been studied for many decades now, and we see that traumatized children carry a high rate of disease and very early death, maybe even up to 20 20 years sooner than the average typical lifespan. Okay. Now, if this right here doesn't show you how, as far as public policies, we really need to have a public policy on stress, because we're talking trillions. I'm talking trillions of dollars of, well, just sunk costs, medical costs, costs on the social service systems, on the prison systems, the healthcare systems, educational systems. Okay, so we're talking just childhood abuse, trauma. That's it. We're not talking workplace stress. We're not talking caregiver stress, or just the various other stressors that are in the typical modernized way of life. Okay, so we're talking a massively parabolic increased rate of disease, early death, as well as social and work problems. So this right here should tell you that we got to have some sort of public policy ASAP regarding preventable stress, at least in children. Okay, let's kind of move up the food chain to adults. Okay, so let me explain to you the biology. Okay, and I'm going to try to do this as simply as possible. Okay, so stress is our adaptive responses to the environment. Okay, and what happens during the stress response? Okay, and this is in my other videos. You can see my other videos. Is that during a healthy stress response, our bodies actually change shape and form, morphology. We call it morphology, expression. Okay, and what happens in order to change ourselves physically to fit the environment? Okay, so like for instance, I use this example a lot because it's easy. I live high in the Andes Mountains, and this is different than the near sea level Texas altitude that I was from, and a lot of Americans or foreigners that come to live here aren't from mountainous regions. So you come and like say for instance Quito is 9,300 feet, about 3,000 meters high. Well, if you're going from sea level to 3,000, now you can see very clearly there is a need to adapt. Okay, we're just using this as a real easy example. Okay, this goes with all forms of stress. So what happens? Your body immediately goes into a stress response. Okay, then, now this is where the biology comes in. Your body then has to figure out, okay, do I have to change myself to fit the environment, or can I change the environment to fit me? Okay. Now, the first strategy is the most ancient strategy, because you don't need to have much of a brain. In fact, you don't need to have hardly any brain at all. When there is a demand for something so basic as oxygen, because oxygen is very thin at high levels and barometric pressure, a lot of stuff are different. It's different at high levels, high altitude. Then your body has to figure out, well, I need to get some more oxygen or I'm going to go into shock and die. Okay, do you understand? So there is a demand. You go from sea level to like say 9,300 feet, and your body goes into a shock. Okay, and then there's a period of time of stabilization where it figures out, okay, I need to get more oxygen. Okay, I need to reconfigure my red blood cells. I need to reconfigure, parts of my respiratory system. I need to grab more oxygen atoms, okay? So what it does, it kind of goes into this temporary, we'll call it jelly-like state, okay? Okay, we're not talking like pure jelly gelatin, like Jell-O, but a relatively more jelly-like state that kind of gives up its form that it had before, the form that it was used to at the lower altitude, And then at the higher altitude, it has to reconfigure and reprogram itself. And this is where we get into different types of DNA expression based on the pressures coming from the environment. Okay? So that is simple. Now, if you go into the complex human aspect of this, where it's mostly social, our problems are mostly social. Not all. We have chemical and physical problems, but having enormous brains, okay, massive brains, the greatest stressor we humans have pretty much is going to be social stressors of any type, including our trauma. Now, what happens during trauma? Okay, so as I told you, when we hit a stress response, our body goes into hopefully temporarily, a more jelly-like state. Okay? Now, in this state, we can reconfigure our tissues to meet the demands of the environment. But here's what you give up. When your body goes under the stress response to adapt itself to the new environment, it becomes vulnerable to damage. Okay? It becomes injury. What do I mean? Okay, so you can't have it both ways. You can have, like, say, a cell at rest. Okay, when a cell is at rest, it's not being stressed. It can reproduce, feed itself, repair itself. Okay, but it has a solid, rigid form. Okay, but when it needs to change, it loses that solid, rigid form. Okay, and it becomes more, I should say, porous to the environment, the influences of the environment. So it becomes more vulnerable to injury, to infection, because again, you've lost some of your rigidity, okay, and because it's being spent adapting, and your cells cannot recuperate very well, they cannot divide and reproduce very well, because all of your energy is tied up in reconfiguring itself. Okay, isn't that marvelous? Okay, so I mean, this is sort of biology of tomorrow, medicine of tomorrow. Okay, you could see a lot of possibilities, but what's the nasty thing that happens when we get stresses piled up, or we get maybe even one massive stressor that our body just cannot get out of that jelly-like state? Do you understand? Especially when you have multiple intense stressors. So you have a stressor. Hopefully you can resolve that stressor and you go to baseline state, your original non-stress state. But when the stressor is massive, or more commonly when it gets piled up, when you have, like for instance, we'll just create a tragic character. Suppose we have a person who went through a lot of childhood adversity. Father was in prison, parents divorced, addiction, abuse, neglect, that kind of thing. Okay. It's not all that uncommon anymore in our society. Okay. So we have that. So we have, like, say, all these demands on an immature nervous system, okay, that doesn't have the frontal lobe. This part of the brain right here is not developed. And I have talked about this in other videos. This part of the brain, the frontal lobe's not developed until you're about 25. And so especially with young children, because this is our major stress response organ for humans and most advanced animals. And because the major stress response organ of humans is not developed and you're putting stress on it, then those humans are going to sustain a lot of stress-related injury that, especially reflected in their immune systems, that is going to just go through life unless they do basically some massive, you can do what you can to resolve these stressors so you don't carry them through your life. Well, so you have that. You're starting out sort of with a disadvantage. And then say you're an adult, and so you have this childhood adversity that you've carried with you. And so you've got that risk right there. You've already got a higher rate of disease and early death risk and social, the odds for financial problems, social problems, work problems, that kind of thing. You've already got, okay, I'm not Don't kill the messenger here. I'm sorry, if this is you. And then, for instance, you're an adult, and within, like, say, the last few years, you have a baby, you divorce, family member dies, you lose your house, you lose your job. Say all hell breaks loose, okay? And you have, what do we have again? A bunch of stressors piled up on top of each other. So you have a baby, and then all of a sudden you have a divorce, and so you see, we're not able to be able to grab our bearings, right? We're not able to stabilize ourselves, right? So when this happens, okay, we permanently enter that jelly-like state, okay? So you want to know when you're stressed why you get sick? I mean, this is something your grandmother, like, don't do this, you're going to get sick. Your grandmother would have told you this. Or, you talk about, like, say, for instance, a risk of a coronary heart attack, or some sort of heart, some sort of cardiac malfunction, whether it's some sort of ischemic attack or, whatever, okay? You could see where when we're in this perpetual jelly-like state, we're not supposed to be in that, except for temporarily, for small intervals of time, okay? But there's something about the modernized culture which piles on the stress, and we're not even talking always major stressors. We're talking maybe a million tiny little stressors. Maybe we have not just social stressors. Maybe we have the stressors. Maybe we take a bunch of medications. That's chemical stress. Maybe we have a very poor diet consisting of transgenic foods. Guys, don't think that this is not causing massive amount of autoimmune problems, okay? If you knew just how bad you'd storm Washington, D.C., I guarantee you. Oh my gosh, what we scientists carry with us, it's almost hard to think straight. Some of the truths about society that we live in. A lot of positive things, but there's a lot of negative things, and we're paying for it big time. So what happens during trauma? Okay, so our organ systems become more vulnerable, okay? Number one. Let's talk about psychological. This is really interesting, guys, okay? I believe it's Porges, Dr. Porges, who's a hero. He's an older guy and just amazing researcher. And I believe this is called the polyvagal theory, okay? Okay, so what am I talking about here? Well, when we go under the stress response, okay, and it overwhelms the fight and flight systems, those are the two sort of biggie systems, because we can fight, overcome the adversarial situation, or we can run and get away from it. Sometimes that's the best thing to do too, okay? But when we're in that freeze mode, okay, we're going to talk about the freeze mode. When we're in the freeze mode, okay, then basically, this is heavy, okay, we basically start to, we shut down. It's called dissociation, okay. You ever heard of dissociation? Okay, what is dissociation? Okay, you guys have probably heard of dissociative identity disorder. Well, that's a form, okay. What is dissociation? You ready? Ready to take notes? Okay. Dissociation is the part occurs when part of your nervous system goes into that freeze mode. Doesn't really come out. Okay, kind of sort of stays there. Okay. And what happens is that you are unable. You're unable to do anything. You're unable to think straight. You're unable to act, like move your muscles to move or fight or run. You freeze, just like the deer in the headlight look. And what is contained? Okay, what is contained? within this dissociative response. Every addiction and bad habit and bad aspect of every mental illness that you can think of. Okay? Let me repeat that again. I want you to write this down. This is good stuff. What is contained in dissociation, especially when it's related to trauma or extreme stress of some sort? Okay? Every addiction. So, that part of you, especially at the end of the day when your frontal lobe is, your frontal lobe is only good for so much, okay? It's one of the newest parts of our brain. It's quirky. It fatigues, just like a muscle. So say you've had a stressful day at work. Say you're on a diet. You have cleaned up your life. You've stopped smoking. You've adopted a lot of trying to adopt a lot of better habits. But why is it after a stressful day at work, you're tired? It's like 8 o'clock at night. Why is it all those good habits go out the door? Okay, think about it. When are you going to overeat? It's going to be after a long day and you're just wanting to check out. Okay? Why do you default to your addictions? Because you're so stressed out. You're just wanting to exit the moment, right? Okay? Why does psychosis happen? Say you've got, a florid case of schizophrenia or bipolar or psychotic depression. It's the same thing. Checking out from reality. Obsessive thoughts. Why do you think they're there? They're there to distract you from whatever stressor. It's different for every person, so you're going to have to figure this out. You're going to have to itemize everything first, okay? But listen to me. This is really deep stuff. Every maladaptive bad habit or default behavior that we have, any type of addiction, anything where like, man, I gotta have that cigarette, I gotta have that, or man, I'm so stressed, let's go shopping, or man, just a few hours, at the casino. Anything where you have like that, where you're wanting to check out. That, my friend, that's what tells you that you've got a problem with uncontrolled extreme stress. Okay? And this is why people, when they get back from, like, say, Afghanistan, war, military, or when they come out of a very difficult childhood, or some other, live in a dangerous neighborhood. This is why people act strange. Also, and I've talked about this in another video. You want to talk about what's going on with the refugee crisis, okay? Well, we've got people whose home countries have been destroyed by war. Okay, and we're not going to talk about why this war, whose fault it is. We know whose fault it is, actually, but, that's a political argument. But, a lot of these countries and, or economies destroyed by war. You have think about this. Whenever you have a bunch of young men without a future, without a way to, I should say, get some sex, or get married, have a relationship, whatever, without any hope, you tend to have these crazy things that you see on the news, okay? So these are people that are traumatized. These are young men that are traumatized. I mean, I'm not saying that, there shouldn't be any personal accountability. I'm just saying that this is how humans act. Happy people are usually not refugees or economic immigrants, okay? And when you leave your family, you leave, what you've known as home, your hometown, especially in these countries where people tend to stick in their community as long as they can until they have to move or they need to move. But you can imagine when You've lost everything. The infrastructure of your city's gone. There's no economy. People are freaked out. I mean, these things happen. Okay, I'm just saying, look at atrocious behavior in the world. Okay? Look how people act. Look how people are acting in the United States right now. They're under extreme stress, if not trauma. Okay? And we don't have the healthcare system to really handle this. This is why we need a national policy, because it's so cheap to prevent. And science is finally catching up. I guess I need to stop here. I can go, I tell you what, I'll make another video next week, and I'll go more into the fascinating biology of this, even more than we have before. But, it's so much cheaper to prevent trauma and stress than it is to try to clean up the damage, that occurs years, if not decades later. So that's one take-home message for today. And oh my God, we can go on. I mean, this is a fascinating subject. But I hope for some of you who do have trauma, I hope that this helps out a little bit. Takes away maybe cuts out the 900-pound gorilla to maybe 400 or 500 pounds. Because you tend to take things really personally when you have disorders of extreme stress. You tend to, and it's just what, you're a normal being, human being, reacting to abnormal circumstances. So just take that home. And again, if you're a victim of extreme stress, or you're a survivor, I should say a survivor of extreme stress, just take that home with you. Maybe it'll make you feel a little bit better. Anyway, we'll talk about this some more, okay? Have a great day.